Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be reviewing Wonder Boy, ASHA in Monster World for the Nintendo Switch. Now this is a 2D platformer that is based off of a Mega Drive game that was actually never released in the West, and it sells currently on the Nintendo Switch eShop for $34.99, making it a decently expensive entry. Question is it an awesome remake, or unfortunately is it stuck in the past? Well, we'll answer that today. Now don't forget that if you do like this content, to please hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Now just before starting the actual review, there is one really important point that I want to go over for this game that will probably affect a lot of people out there. And that this game, contrary to usual, is a game that you should seriously look at picking up physically if you're interested in it. Number one, I've seen physical versions currently on sale going for cheaper than the eShop download price. And secondly, if you actually get the physical version of the game, you get a free copy of the original Mega Drive game for the Nintendo Switch that this game was basically a remake of. Unfortunately, currently, for the digital version, when you download it, you don't get that bonus. So therefore, if you can find this game at a decent price physically, seriously look at picking up the physical version before jumping into the digital download. Now first things first, just let's get a grip on what this game actually is. So Wonder Boy ASHA in Monster World, which from now on, by the way, I'll refer to simply as ASHA, is a remake of a Mega Drive, or what we called here a Sega Genesis game that unfortunately never made its way out of Japan. And that original game was called Monster World 4. And effectively, this game is related to other releases that we have on the Switch, which is the Wonder Boy remix. We also have Wonder Boy 3, and we even have Monster Boy and the Cursed Kingdom. This game is basically in the same line as those previous entries on the Switch. So first of all, ASHA is at its heart a 2D platformer. There are some fake 3D elements that have sort of popped into this game, where at certain moments, at context areas, you can switch planes, meaning that there's like a foreground and a background. But since these are only context sensitive, and once you're into that new plane, you're back to standard 2D platforming gameplay. Ultimately, this is a 2D action platformer. The control scheme for your basic character is also very simple in this game, as were games of that period, with basically simply a jump button that is set to B and an attack button that is set to Y. After a certain number of successful attacks, you can also hold down the ZR trigger to unlock a double damage attack. Also, very early on in the gameplay, you will unlock your companion character, the Pepe Logu, which will add a few extra abilities to your toolbox. Ultimately, by holding down the L button, once the Pepe Logu has actually flown to you, if you jump off a ledge, you'll be able to glide rather than drop. And secondly, if you hit the jump button, you'll have access to a double jump rather than a simple jump. All the other abilities that the Pepe Logu unlock are context sensitive and basically help you in solving the puzzles throughout the levels. So if you throw your Pepe Logu at certain areas of the game, he'll automatically interact with the environment and basically will help you solve some puzzles. Now the visual presentation in ASHA is quite appealing, with some nice, vibrant, and colorful characters. The backgrounds are also very smoothly animated, and ultimately they bring a new life to the original game that was Monster World 4. The downside, however, to these graphics is that if you've actually played Wonder Boy 3 or Monster Boy, it's actually a slight downgrade from those other two remakes. The music, however, is actually quite fitting for the overall gameplay and is a nice reimagining of the original tunes. Obviously, they don't have that quite Sega Genesis feeling to them, but at the same time, I think nowadays a lot of people would find that unappealing. Lastly, the monster variety is pretty decent for this game, but although they try to make this a very faithful remake, and we'll talk about it in a couple of seconds in my overall evaluations of the game, the monster designs are ultimately, I would say, very simple for a 2D platformer. Even the boss fights themselves, the strategies employed by the bosses are not that varied, and you'll easily be able to overcome them after one or two tries. What that means is, although ASHA in Monster World has a slight level of difficulty to it, it is a platformer that is pretty much accessible to everyone and that veterans will not find very challenging. Now we'll talk about the evaluation of the game. And overall, I want to be very honest, there's going to be two types of people that are going to play ASHA, and they will have two completely different types of reactions. Number one, you have people who are used to retro gaming and appreciate the tropes that come with retro games. And I think that for that public, ASHA will be a very enjoyable experience. The second public is maybe people who like retro-inspired games, but like remakes that bring the games up to today's standards, both in gameplay and also in mechanics. Unfortunately for those people, I think they'll be quite disappointed in ASHA on the other hand. And the reason behind this is that ASHA is such a faithful remake to the original that it's almost doing so to a fault. Where it hasn't also reproduced what made the first game great, it's also reproduced the faults that come with dated gameplay. Now, the first one of these retro gaming aspects that I think will divide people in ASHA is the actual controls themselves. ASHA feels like she controls a little bit sluggishly. But, like I said, it isn't due to input delay, it is due to faithfulness to those Sega Genesis era games where the sort of inputs always seem a little delayed, although they aren't really. As a retro gamer, once I got used to this aspect, it became second nature where you sort of get used to how to react to the different inputs. Secondly, some of the level designs could have been updated because this game has a lot of backtracking in the levels. Now, this was a trick back in the day due to limited resources to actually extend the gameplay in games. But nowadays, those are unneeded and some of the levels could have been reworked in more interesting ways rather than have you revisit the same corridors sometimes 2 or 3 times before actually completing the level. And lastly, I would have seen maybe some updated AI on this game because, as I said earlier, although the variety in enemies is perfectly fine, there isn't that much variety in the way the enemies react. You sort of get new color coding and new elementals to the same enemies you saw in previous levels. And unfortunately, the way you deal with these enemies are the same way you dealt with their foes, simply maybe equipping a lightning shield rather than a fire shield. And lastly, the bosses themselves could have had some updated mechanics, because as I said, generally a lot of the bosses will have maybe 1 to 3 phases, but each one of those phases are quite repetitive and the boss pretty much only has one action and one tactic to beat him. Also, this next point isn't really a negative. This game does not autosave at any point. You can pretty much save at any point in the game other than pretty much boss fights, but you have to do so manually. And please do not forget to save. I played through at one point almost an hour of gameplay forgetting to save, and ultimately, if you die that last death, meaning that you've used all your potions and ASHA really truly dies, you will lose all your progress and have to start back from your last save point. So at one point, I even lost almost an hour to an hour and a half of progress in the game. Now, here's where my job as a reviewer becomes a little difficult, because I'm in the first camp. I have no problem with retro gaming. I regularly play Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis cartridges still nowadays on a regular basis. And I enjoyed my time with ASHA quite a bit, basically playing a Sega Genesis game with a fresh coat of paint on it. And ultimately, I wasn't too annoyed by these tropes, but I always have to try to look at it from everyone's perspective, and not only focus on my enjoyment of the game. Also, I think that one disservice that is done to this game is that it is one of the last entries we got from the Monster World / Wonder Boy series, and it feels like one of the lesser remakes. Both Wonder Boy 3 and Monster Boy in the Cursed Kingdom feel like superior remakes to ASHA. And at least one of those games was based on an earlier entry in the perspective of when the games were originally released, which will probably disappoint a few people out there, especially if you really liked the remake of Wonder Boy 3 and were looking for an even more modern entry. And lastly, the fact that the game itself includes the original game in the physical version, but doesn't include it in the digital download version of the game, in my opinion, at the price they're asking for the digital version is pretty much unforgivable. And I really don't want to hear about licensing issues or anything like that. If you're offering the original game with the physical version, but you're not really selling the digital version any cheaper, and like I've said, I've even seen the physical version on discount cheaper than the digital one, you should really include that original game with both versions of the game so that people who bought the digital version don't feel bad about their purchase. And look, I feel bad about it, and I have the physical version, so I'm not in that camp of people that might have been disappointed, but I feel bad for the people who would have bought the digital version, especially at the price they're selling it for. So now, let's move on to the verdict for Wonder Boy ASHA in Monster World, and if this is the first one of my reviews that you're watching, just to let you know, I don't give a numerical score, I give an overall statement on whether I recommend purchasing the game or not. If you want to see what all those different statements are, you can check down below in the description of the video. They're all down there. Now, my overall rating for ASHA is going to be a solid game, but there is going to be a couple of asterisks that I'll get right into. Now, the first asterisk is if you're a huge fan of retro gaming and you really enjoy retro games, I could even see this as a definite pickup. But for the physical version only, not for the digital version currently. And the second asterisk is that if this game would be, I would say $10 to $15 cheaper, ergo, once it goes on sale for let's say 50% or more, this will also become a definite pickup in my book. Because nonetheless, at its heart, the game is good enough to be worth it, maybe just not at this price, unless, as I said earlier, you're a huge fan of retro gaming. But nonetheless, I would still say it's a solid 2D platformer, and there's a lot of fun to be had here, although it's not the best version of a Wonder Boy game that we have on the Nintendo Switch. So that is pretty much it for my review of Wonder Boy ASHA in Monster World. Let me know if you picked up the game, what you think about it. Do you agree with my evaluation of the game, or do you disagree? And also, on the way out, as I said at the beginning, don't forget that if you did like this content, to hit the like button, subscribe if you aren't already, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you know when all my future videos come out. And as usual, I hope I'll see you in my next video.